For 30 years, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance kept a secret locked behind her silent stare. When reporters asked about her time in naval special warfare, she simply smiled and changed the subject. When fellow veterans pressed her about that winter deployment off the Alaskan coast in 1993, she walked away without a word. Her family learned never to mention those missing 4 months, the ones that aged her a decade in what seemed like weeks. But secrets have weight, and some burdens grow heavier with time until silence becomes its own kind of prison. 3 weeks ago, sitting in a hospital bed with doctors telling her she had months left to live, Sarah made a decision that would send shockwaves through the naval intelligence community and beyond. She picked up the phone and called the one journalist she trusted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. What she revealed in those recorded sessions was not just a story about a covert mission gone wrong. It was testimony about courage under impossible circumstances, about a team that discovered something in those freezing waters that the government buried deeper than any ocean trench. It was about choices made in darkness, about loyalty tested beyond breaking points, and about truths too dangerous to speak until death removes the fear of consequence. Some say the ocean keeps its secrets forever. Sarah Vance proved them wrong. The question that haunts everyone who hears her story is simple yet profound. If you discovered something that could change everything we understand about our world, but revealing it might cost innocent lives, would you speak or would you stay silent? What would you do? Sarah Vance grew up in a coastal town in Maine where the Atlantic Ocean was both provider and threat, where fishing boats disappeared into fog and sometimes never returned. Her father captained a lobster boat. Her mother worked at the cannery, and every Sunday they went to a small church where the pastor prayed for those lost at sea. Sarah was the youngest of 4 children and the only girl, which meant she learned early how to be tough, how to hold her own, and how to earn respect rather than expect it. She also learned that the ocean demanded respect above all else, that its beauty masked dangers most people never comprehended until too late. When she told her family at 17 that she wanted to join the Navy, her father simply nodded as if he had always known. Her mother cried but did not argue. Her brothers, already working the fishing routes, understood that Sarah needed something beyond the predictable rhythm of their small-town existence. Boot camp at Great Lakes was everything the recruiters promised and nothing like Sarah imagined. The physical demands pushed her body to limits she had not known existed. The mental pressure tested her resolve daily. But she discovered something crucial about herself during those transformative weeks. She was capable of far more than she had ever believed. She excelled in navigation, showed natural aptitude for tactical thinking, and demonstrated the kind of calm under pressure that instructors noticed immediately. When her company commander pulled her aside during the 7th week and asked if she had ever considered applying for specialized training, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition that her path was leading somewhere she had never planned, but somehow always expected. The early 90s were a complicated time for women in the military. Combat exclusion policies still barred women from many roles. Yet quiet exceptions existed for those with rare skills and the determination to push through barriers that remained officially unacknowledged. Sarah learned quickly that excellence was not enough. She needed to be flawless. Every mistake was magnified, every achievement minimized. She studied harder, trained longer, and volunteered for assignments others avoided. She became an expert in cold weather operations, earned advanced certifications in underwater navigation, and proved herself in joint exercises that left seasoned male sailors struggling to keep pace. Her performance caught the attention of a naval intelligence unit that operated in shadows, recruiting talent for missions that would never appear in official records. The call came during her 3rd year of service. A classified program needed personnel with her specific skill set, cold weather expertise, navigation abilities, and psychological resilience. The interview process lasted 3 days and felt more like interrogation than recruitment. They wanted to know everything: her breaking points, her fears, her capacity for keeping secrets even from family. They presented ethical scenarios with no right answers and watched how she reasoned through impossible choices. When they finally offered her the assignment, they were clear about the cost. If she accepted, parts of her life would become compartmentalized forever, sealed behind walls even she might struggle to remember building. The team Sarah joined consisted of 12 personnel, a mix of Navy SEALs, intelligence specialists, and scientists with security clearances that exceeded standard classification levels. She was the only woman, a fact that surprised no one, including herself. The mission briefing took place in a windowless room at a naval facility whose location she was never told. The commanding officer, a grizzled SEAL named Jackson who spoke with economy that suggested every word mattered, explained their objective with disturbing simplicity. Soviet submarines had been detected operating in unusual patterns off the Alaskan coast. Satellite imagery suggested they were searching for something, conducting grid patterns inconsistent with standard patrol routes. Intelligence analysts believed the Soviets had lost something during the Cold War, something they desperately wanted to recover before American forces discovered it first. The team would deploy to a covert research station disguised as a weather monitoring facility on a remote Alaskan island. Their mission was threefold: identify what the Soviets were searching for, recover it if possible, and ensure that whatever it was did not fall into hostile hands. The operation was designated non-existent. If anything went wrong, official channels would deny all knowledge. There would be no rescue, no public acknowledgement, no medals for success or honors for sacrifice. Sarah listened to these terms without flinching, recognizing that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no simple return. The other team members watched her reactions carefully. These men who had worked together before, who shared history and trust she would need to earn through actions rather than words. Training for the mission took 6 weeks at a facility in the Aleutian Islands where temperatures dropped below zero and winds cut through gear like knives through fabric. They practiced underwater recovery operations in conditions that made every dive a calculated risk. They rehearsed communication protocols using equipment that seemed barely adequate for the environment they would face. Sarah learned that Jackson commanded through demonstration rather than declaration, that he pushed everyone, including himself, beyond comfortable limits, and that his team followed him because he had never asked them to do anything he would not do first. She also learned that one team member, a young SEAL named Cooper, resented her presence with barely concealed hostility. He never said it directly, but his body language spoke volumes during briefings, and his sarcasm cut at her during training exercises. The confrontation came during their 4th week when Cooper made a mistake during a drill that could have proven fatal in actual operations. Rather than acknowledge his error, he blamed Sarah's positioning, claiming she had distracted him at a critical moment. Jackson stopped the exercise immediately. What happened next taught Sarah more about leadership than any classroom instruction. Jackson did not defend her or attack Cooper. Instead, he reset the drill and ran it again, this time positioning himself where Sarah had been. When Cooper made the same mistake, Jackson halted everything and asked a simple question. Was Cooper claiming that Jackson had also been the problem? Or was Cooper ready to own his error and learn from it? The silence that followed was absolute. Cooper apologized, not just to Jackson but to Sarah directly, and something shifted in the team dynamics from that moment forward. They arrived at the research station in late November when daylight lasted only a few hours and darkness ruled the world. The facility was Spartan, prefabricated buildings clustered against brutal winds, generators that rumbled constantly, and heating systems that struggled against the relentless cold. The isolation was immediate and absolute. The nearest civilian population was hundreds of miles away. Communication with command was limited to scheduled check-ins using encrypted channels. The team settled into routines designed to maintain readiness and sanity in equal measure. Sarah shared quarters with the 2 scientists, both of whom treated her with professional courtesy that felt refreshing after weeks of proving herself to military personnel. They explained their role. If the team recovered Soviet technology, the scientists would assess its nature and significance. The first 2 weeks consisted of surveillance operations, monitoring Soviet submarine activity using passive sonar arrays deployed along the continental shelf. The Soviets were methodical, covering search grids with patience that suggested they knew approximately where their lost asset had gone down but lacked precise coordinates. Jackson made the decision to let them continue searching, reasoning that Soviet resources and determination might lead American forces directly to the target. It was a calculated risk that required discipline from the entire team. They watched, they waited, and they prepared for the moment when observation would shift to action. Sarah stood watch rotations like everyone else, spending hours in the monitoring station watching sonar displays and listening to the strange sounds of the deep ocean. Whale songs and shifting ice and the distant throb of submarine propellers. The discovery happened during Sarah's watch on the 14th night. The Soviet submarine had stopped moving, holding position over a section of the seafloor at approximately 800 feet depth. Sarah immediately notified Jackson, who arrived in the monitoring station within minutes despite the late hour. They watched together as the submarine deployed what appeared to be a remotely operated vehicle, the telltale signature of its movements distinct on the sonar display. For 3 hours, the ROV conducted operations on the seafloor while the team documented everything. When the Soviet submarine finally began moving again, heading away from the site rather than recovering anything, Jackson made his call. Whatever was down there, the Soviets had found it but could not retrieve it, at least not with the equipment currently available to them. That meant a window of opportunity existed, but only if the American team moved immediately. Planning the dive took 2 days of intense preparation. The depth was within technical diving limits, but barely, and the water temperature was cold enough to kill within minutes if their heating systems failed. The team would go down in pairs, with Sarah designated as navigator for the primary dive team because of her superior underwater navigation skills. Cooper would be her dive partner, a pairing that felt deliberately designed to test whether their earlier conflict had truly resolved. They spent hours reviewing procedures, checking equipment redundancies, and running through emergency protocols until every action became muscle memory. The night before the dive, Jackson gathered everyone together not for a formal briefing, but for a conversation. He reminded them that their mission mattered, but their lives mattered more. No objective was worth a preventable death. If anything felt wrong, they would abort and reassess. It was permission to trust their instincts, and Sarah felt the weight of his confidence in her judgment. The dive began before dawn, launching from a small vessel that looked like a fishing boat, but carried specialized equipment hidden below deck. Sarah and Cooper entered the water together, the shock of cold immediate even through their insulated dry suits and heating systems. Descending through darkness lit only by their headlamps felt like falling through space, the beam of light swallowed by endless black. Sarah focused on her instruments, tracking their depth and position, while Cooper managed their descent rate and equipment checks. They communicated through hand signals and occasional comments over the communications system, their voices sounding strange and distant through the electronic transmission. At 400 feet, they paused to equalize and check systems. Everything was functioning within parameters, but Sarah could feel the pressure in ways that went beyond physical sensation. A psychological weight of depth and isolation, and the growing awareness of how far they were from safety. The seafloor appeared gradually, a landscape of rock and sediment illuminated in the narrow cone of their lights. Sarah checked their coordinates against the target location, then signaled Cooper to follow as she navigated toward the Soviet site. They found it within 10 minutes. Debris scattered across the seafloor, pieces of metal twisted and broken, clearly the remains of something that had suffered catastrophic failure. But the debris pattern was wrong. Sarah had studied enough wreckage analysis to recognize that whatever had happened here, it was not a simple crash or sinking. The distribution suggested an explosion, but the pieces themselves showed damage inconsistent with conventional munitions. Some of the metal appeared melted rather than shattered, edges smooth and strange where they should have been jagged and torn. Cooper spotted the main object first, partially buried in sediment at the edge of the debris field. It was cylindrical, roughly the size of a car, with surface markings that included Cyrillic characters and symbols Sarah did not recognize. They circled it carefully, documenting with cameras while avoiding direct contact. Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The sediment around the object showed disturbance patterns suggesting the Soviet ROV had attempted to attach lifting cables but had failed or abandoned the effort. She signaled Cooper to help her clear sediment from one end of the cylinder, working carefully to expose what appeared to be a hatch or access panel. What they found underneath changed everything. The panel was open, and the interior of the cylinder was empty. Whatever this container had held, it was gone. They spent another 20 minutes searching the immediate area, expanding their grid pattern to cover all possible dispersal trajectories. Sarah found fragments that made no sense. Pieces that appeared biological rather than mechanical, tissue samples preserved by cold water and pressure, and structures that looked almost organic but with geometries that defied natural explanation. She collected samples using specialized containers, her training overriding the instinctive unease building in her chest. Cooper found something else, a Soviet equipment pack tangled in rocks, the kind ROV operators used to secure tools and samples. Inside were documents in waterproof cases, which they secured for intelligence analysis. Their bottom time was expiring, the decompression obligations mounting with every additional minute at depth. Sarah made the call to ascend, and Cooper agreed without argument. The decompression stops on the way up gave Sarah time to think, hanging in the water column at prescribed depths while her body off-gassed nitrogen to prevent the bends. Something about the mission felt wrong now in ways she could not articulate. They had found the Soviet target, but instead of answers, they had collected only more questions. What had been in that cylinder? Why had it been deployed in these waters? What had happened to cause the destruction they had witnessed? And most troubling, what were the biological samples she had collected? By the time they surfaced, Sarah had made a decision. She needed to speak privately with Jackson before the scientists examined what they had recovered. Jackson listened to Sarah's concerns in his quarters, away from the rest of the team. She described what they had found, emphasizing the details that troubled her most: the empty cylinder, the biological samples, the nature of the damage to the debris. Jackson asked careful questions, his expression giving away nothing, but Sarah noticed he took notes on everything she said, which was not his usual practice. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. He told her that she had done exactly the right thing by reporting her observations directly to him. He asked her not to discuss her concerns with anyone else, including Cooper, until after the scientists completed their initial analysis. It was not an order but a request, framed in a way that acknowledged Sarah's judgment while asking for her trust. She agreed, though the conversation left her with more questions than answers. The scientists worked through the night examining the recovered materials. Sarah tried to sleep but found herself lying awake, listening to the wind howling outside and the constant rumble of generators. She kept seeing those biological samples in her mind, the wrongness of their structure, the way they seemed to occupy a space between categories she understood. When morning came, or what passed for morning in the perpetual darkness of Alaskan winter, Jackson called a team meeting. His face was drawn, and Sarah recognized the expression of someone who had received information that changed everything. The scientists presented their findings with clinical precision, but the implications were anything but clinical. The biological samples were unlike anything in existing databases. They showed characteristics that suggested terrestrial origin, but with cellular structures that indicated adaptation to extreme environments over timescales that made no evolutionary sense. The documents recovered from the Soviet equipment pack, once translated, revealed that the cylinder had been part of a secret Soviet research program investigating anomalous biological entities recovered from deep ocean environments during the early Cold War. The program had been attempting to transport specimens to a research facility when something went catastrophically wrong. The entity or entities had breached containment. What happened next was unclear from the fragmentary documents. But the last entries suggested the Soviets had deliberately destroyed their own vessel to prevent the specimens from reaching populated areas. The question that hung in the air was terrible in its simplicity. Where were those specimens now? Had they died in the cold, deep waters? Or had they survived, adapted, and spread? The scientists admitted they had no answers, only hypotheses that ranged from optimistic to nightmarish. Jackson made an immediate decision. They would expand their search, looking for any evidence of the specimens or their impact on local ecosystem. They would also maintain absolute communication silence with command until they had something definitive to report. The last thing anyone needed was panic based on incomplete information. Sarah understood the logic, but also recognized the tremendous responsibility Jackson was assuming, making decisions that could have strategic implications while operating in the dark both literally and figuratively. The expanded search took another 3 weeks, during which the team conducted multiple dives and deployed autonomous sensors across a wider area. They found scattered debris, more fragments of the Soviet research program, and signs that something had disturbed the local marine environment in unusual ways. Fish populations showed behavioral anomalies. Sediment samples contained trace organic compounds that did not match known species. But they found no definitive evidence of the specimens themselves, no proof that the entities had survived or posed ongoing threat. It was the absence of evidence that troubled Sarah most. In her experience, the ocean eventually revealed its secrets. The fact that they were finding only hints and shadows suggested something capable of avoiding detection, which implied intelligence or at least sophisticated survival adaptations. Cooper approached Sarah during the final week of operations, asking to talk privately. They walked outside despite the brutal cold, needing the privacy that the wind and darkness provided. Cooper told her that he had been wrong about her from the beginning, that she had proven herself beyond any doubt, and that he trusted her judgment more than anyone else on the team except Jackson. He also told her that he was scared, genuinely frightened in a way that years of combat operations had never made him feel. He asked Sarah what she thought they should do, whether they should report everything to command and let higher authorities make the decisions, or whether Jackson's approach of gathering complete information first was the right call. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. She told Cooper that she believed in following the chain of command, but she also believed that leaders needed complete and accurate information to make good decisions, and they did not have that yet. The decision point came during a winter storm that trapped them inside the facility for 72 hours. Jackson gathered the team and presented them with a choice. They had completed their mission parameters. They had identified what the Soviets were searching for, documented it thoroughly, and recovered intelligence materials. They could return to command with their findings and let others decide next steps. Or they could recommend an extended deployment to continue investigating the biological specimens. Acknowledging that such a recommendation would trigger a much larger response involving resources and personnel they could not predict or control. Jackson did something Sarah had never seen a commanding officer do. He asked for a team vote, not binding but consultative, wanting to know what everyone thought before he made his final call. The discussion that followed lasted hours and revealed the character of every person present. The scientists argued for immediate escalation, believing the potential biological implications demanded resources beyond their small team's capacity. Some of the SEALs wanted to continue operations independently, distrusting bureaucratic responses and believing they were best positioned to handle whatever threats existed. Cooper surprised Sarah by arguing for a middle path, complete the current deployment, but prepare a comprehensive report that would make clear the urgency without triggering panic. Sarah spoke last, gathering her thoughts before addressing the team. She said that she believed they had a moral obligation to report what they had found, but they also had an obligation to report it accurately and completely. She argued for taking the additional time to gather as much information as possible, even if it meant personal risk, because the consequences of incomplete or alarmist reporting could be worse than the threat itself. Jackson listened to everyone, then made his decision. They would take one more week for intensive investigation, deploying every resource and technique available to them. After that, they would return and report everything regardless of whether they had found definitive answers. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that everyone could accept. The final week was the most intense of the entire deployment. They conducted round-the-clock operations, pushing equipment and personnel to absolute limits. Sarah participated in 3 more deep dives, each one revealing small additional pieces of the puzzle, but never the complete picture they sought. On the last dive, Sarah went deeper than before, following a signal from one of their deployed sensors. What she found at 900 feet, working at the edge of safe diving limits, was a cave system in the underwater cliff face. Inside the entrance, she discovered evidence that something had been there recently: disturbed sediment, organic residue on the rocks, and most tellingly, marks that looked deliberate rather than natural, as if something had been manipulating the environment with purpose. She collected samples and documented everything, but she also made a judgment call. She did not enter the cave system. The risk was too great, the unknowns too profound. Instead, she marked the location precisely and surfaced to report. Jackson agreed with her decision immediately. They had found something significant, and now it was time to bring in the larger resources needed to investigate properly. The journey back to command felt longer than the deployment itself. Sarah spent the transit time helping compile the comprehensive report, ensuring that every observation was documented with precision, every hypothesis clearly labeled as such, every conclusion supported by evidence. When they finally briefed senior leadership, the response was exactly what Jackson had predicted: shock, followed by urgent activity, followed by classification levels that locked everything behind walls of secrecy. The team was debriefed extensively, then ordered to never discuss the mission with anyone lacking appropriate clearance. Sarah returned to regular duties, but the experience had changed her in ways she was still processing. The years that followed brought Sarah promotions, commendations for classified work, and eventually retirement with honors. But she carried the weight of that Alaskan deployment every day, wondering what had become of the investigation, whether the specimens had been found, whether the threat had been neutralized or merely buried under classification and denial. She followed reports of unusual marine phenomena off Alaska, searching for clues in scientific literature and news reports. She never found anything definitive, which meant either the situation had been successfully contained or successfully hidden. The uncertainty was its own kind of burden, the knowledge that some questions might never have answers.